there is a carbon footprint that's directly associated with producing these hydrocarbons. The place where you can reduce that intensity is by looking at things like this. How do we drill, frack, and complete and produce these wells and do them with as low of a carbon footprint as we can?
This is Energy Cast, and I'm Jay Downhauer. Today we're talking about getting credit for the carbon saved producing hydrocarbons. We discussed this as recently as episode 178. Oil and gas produces carbon, sure, but that doesn't mean you can't make huge gains if you tweak the way you get this resource out of the ground, either by energy consumed or getting every last drop out of the wells you drill. And it's now to the point where those who track carbon monitoring have recognized the oil and gas community for these savings. The company in question, my guest today, wasn't a large oil and gas company. They don't even drill for the stuff. Instead, they provide a drilling fluid used in the production of oil and gas that few people outside the industry have ever heard of. The chemical is called a biosurfactant. Surfactants, generally speaking, make oil move easier through permeable rock. We all know oil and water separate, right? Surfactants allow the oil to emulsify into water in the form of tiny droplets. Another property of surfactants is that they reduce surface tension. Ever see a bead of water on a countertop? An emulsifier will cause those beads to spread out. My guest says surfactants are able to unlock hydrocarbons from rocks during all three phases of oil and gas production. Those include primary production, where oil and gas comes to the surface on its own, secondary production, or injecting water into a formation to increase the pressure, and tertiary production, injecting steam, chemicals, or even CO2 into the formation to, quote, flood the formation and push the rest of the recoverable oil and gas to the surface. By getting more oil and gas out of each well and reducing the amount of energy it takes to perform these secondary and tertiary recoveries, producers are now able to get more carbon clarity on the value these products provide. My guest today is Marty Shumway, Senior Vice President at Locus Bioenergy, a producer of biosurfactants for the oil and gas industry. Locus was founded in 2017. Marty has been with the company since that time. Last year, they announced their biosurfactant became the world's first certified enhanced oil recovery technology for a standard that tracks greenhouse gas management. That means, and it's still early days, that any company that uses this product can claim a reduction in CO2. Marty and I go deep into how surfactants increase oil production and the differences between conventional and unconventional oil production, which is what fracking is. I shared some of my experiences working with groups who wanted to make CO2 enhanced oil recovery more popular. And we also have a very frank discussion about whether oil and gas customers are going to spend more on a product just because it's greener. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Marty Shumway. We're here with Marty Shumway, Senior Vice President of Locus Bioenergy. And Marty, I recently had on a guest, Upwing Energy, and they had a technology for making production of gas wells more efficient. They had a compressor at the bottom of the well bore. And it seems like we're hearing a lot more about the carbon intensity and maybe energy intensity of hydrocarbon production. When did you think this started becoming a bigger priority for oil and gas production?
Well, I think there's a number of factors that are contributing to that being an area of interest. I think primarily for oil producers, there's been a lot of efforts towards certified green gas in the natural gas market. So lots of technologies and things there where operators are able to receive premium pricing for their commodities on the natural gas side. And I think oil is another one that has been sort of overlooked for a long period of time. I think there's a lot of indications that fossil fuels and hydrocarbons are going to be part of our energy mix for decades to come. So I think that the idea of looking at the carbon intensity of produced oil makes a lot of sense for me. And I think the oil industry in particular is kind of catching up to what the gas industry has already realized and done.
Yeah. One of the things when it comes to oil and gas is enhanced oil recovery. My experience from that really came through working for the carbon capture policymakers and using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. Kind of killed two birds, right? You sequestered CO2 and you were able to recover oil that wasn't potentially recoverable there. You don't drill another well. You're using a biosurfactant. What's the difference? And tell us a little bit about what they are.
Sure. So first off, let's talk a little bit about oil production. Historically, there's three phases of oil recovery that come from a field. The first one is what's called primary production. That's where hydrocarbons are produced under the natural driving forces in the reservoir. Typically, after a well is depleted using primary production methods, they start to look at things like water floods. So water floods are the next phase in recovery where you're re-injecting water into the formation and moving hydrocarbons towards those producers to improve that oil recovery. I think important to keep in mind when you're looking at conventional formations, most conventional formations under that primary phase of production recover probably less than 15% of the original oil in place. And so the next phase of that water recovery in most field applications does a pretty good job to collect an additional 10 or 15% of that original oil in place. Now, at that point, we've still got 70% of the oil that's remaining in place. And that's where the secondary recovery with things like chemical floods and polymer floods and things like that come into play. CO2 is a class of one of those recovery methods. And the reason that CO2 works in an oil field is that the oil under certain pressures and conditions is fully miscible in that CO2. So as you're injecting CO2 into the reservoir, you're basically sweeping and picking up those additional hydrocarbon molecules and producing them. And through that CO2, you can improve that recovery even more. So where biosurfactants differ is that we have shown performance and been able to demonstrate increases in production in wells that are still in their primary phase. We can fit into multiple levels of the life cycle of a field, right? Whether it's on primary production where we go in and treat wells with our chemistry to improve production on that primary leg. We can also play well with CO2 injection. Oftentimes the CO2 is injected with pulses of CO2 and then pulses of water. Our chemistry plays nicely in that water phase of that. So we can participate in all three phases of the production. And I guess the game changer with oil production, at least in the U.S. onshore and other tight formations globally, there hasn't been a lot of efforts to water flood shale formations because of the very tight rocks. It's very difficult to move fluids through those rocks. And we offer an alternative on these unconventional or tight oil formations where our products have been successfully used in very simple pump jobs to flood the reservoir and then increase production when the well flows back. So we see ourselves as being different type of chemistry. The biosurfactants offer a lot of unique properties that conventional or typical surfactants don't offer. One of those being its ability to show production increases for very long times after single injections into the reservoir. So up to 3 years, we've had certain wells that we have treated that are still showing production increases of up to 30% over that forecast number 3 years after an initial treatment. So we don't replace any of the existing technologies for enhanced oil recovery, but we can certainly augment them. And we're also applicable on single well type operations, which is a little bit different than normal path of a field development.
Yeah. Marty, let's drill in a little bit, no pun intended, with biosurfactants and surfactants. So tell us what you're doing because it's a biosurfactant.
Sure. And I think this is a good time to make a key distinction. So there's a lot of bio-based surfactants that are on the market today. These are products that are reacted with traditional methods using bio-based materials, right? So they use sugars and vegetable oils in a chemical process to react and make a surfactant that chemically looks very similar to a petrochemical-based surfactant. Most surfactants that are used in the oil field today, and in fact, in every industry that uses surface active molecules, which is what a surfactant is, most of those are reacted or manufactured using petrochemical inputs. What we have done is developed a fermentation process that produces these high performance molecules that are biosurfactant class. The fermentation process that we use uses vegetable oils and sugars, and through the reaction process in the fermenter, it produces a very concentrated biosurfactant that is then used by us to formulate into oil field products. So our process is very low energy. It occurs in a non-industrial or very light industrial setting, which differentiates us from traditional chemical surfactants and how they're made and used.
Is there any concern about heat and pressure and lack of oxygen when you're using a bio-based product like this?
Not necessarily. Historically, there's been a lot of biologics used in the oil field. In fact, the first applications of bio-type enhanced oil recovery probably occurred by accident with contaminated waters and things things like that, where actual microbes were introduced into the reservoir. Those microbes live in situ in the reservoir and produce these surfactants. We decidedly are very different than that. Our process is one where we produce these biosurfactants. They are sterilized. There is no organic or living material in the final product. And then we formulate products that look and feel like existing oil field chemistry. So while the bio side has been in oil and gas for a very long time, we're different in that we are manufacturing or producing these biosurfactants as a specialty chemical that is then built into products that the oil field is familiar with and uses on a daily basis.
Yeah. In a previous life, I worked in oil and gas services industry, basically water treatment, fracking, and our big specialty was doing chlorine dioxide treatments downhole.
Yes.
Basically killing all the bugs.
Yeah. And that's one thing that I want to be clear is that our biosurfactant, obviously, we're not in the business of introducing bacteria and biologicals to the reservoir. We produce and use these as purified and sterilized chemistries in our applications.
Yeah. It was a fun little period. It was good.
Yeah.
You discuss on your website about not needing to frack or drill. And I think this is another thing that I believe another company which I recently spoke to is proposing this idea of you're able to go back to these depleted wells, these places where you have a lot of the oil and gas still in place. That's what you're talking about, right? When we're talking about not having to frack or drill. Are we just talking about the offset of going back to these wells that have already been drilled?
Sure. Yes. For the certification that we're talking about, that is absolutely the point. And we're not suggesting that we can eliminate hydraulic fracturing and drilling by using our chemistry. However, based on the amount of oil and hydrocarbons that are left in place through the production periods of an existing well, and I always think about it in terms of conservation of resources, right? Like you have an existing asset that's a fixed cost investment to drill and complete a well. And what we offer is a way to offset or reduce the number of wells that you need to drill to keep your production flat by using these types of jobs to enhance production on that existing asset. So it's really in terms of conservation of resources and using the existing assets to their fullest potential, it adds a lot to that table. Now, we also have chemistries that we use in hydraulic fracturing, so our surfactants are very good in the completion phase of a reservoir as well. But the primary focus of this conversation today is using our chemistries to squeeze a little bit more hydrocarbon out of an existing asset base.
Just going back to this, I know you touched on this and you touched what your biosurfactant does when it comes to fracked wells, the ones that have the sand in them, that have the water in them. You're opening up the geology. One more time, what role can enhanced oil recovery play in these unconventional wells? And I don't for the life of me remember any talk about there being enhanced oil recovery using, for instance, CO2 in a fracked well, right?
Yeah. So that class of wells, we call them tight oil wells. So there's been quite a bit of work done on gas repressurization or very large injection jobs where you go in and you're pumping natural gas to repressure the formation and do things like that. These are all very large capital intensive methods, right? So you're setting up compressors, you go through a period of gas injection that might last 3 months or 6 months, and then you turn the well back around and produce. And those have been successful in increasing production in these tight oil wells. But what we've developed and what we offer is a very simple, low-cost application method where we're pumping a volume of water. In some cases, we use blends of fresh and produced water or even 100% produced water, depending on the chemistry of the water. But what we do is in a very simple way, we displace fluid into the reservoir, and our biosurfactant that's included in that fluid package that is pumped, we do things like lower the surface tension of the water, we lower the interfacial tension between crude oil and water, and we lower the contact angle of the reservoir. So all of those things together are important for mobilizing crude oil. What we've learned and what we've seen is things that differentiate us from other surfactants in those types of applications is survivability in the reservoir. So when we do call them a squeeze job or a fluid huff and puff job where you're pumping volumes of water that include our biosurfactant chemistry, we see production responses that last for very long times, which I believe is a differentiator from going in with a traditional surfactant and pumping a job like that. So what that tells us is that we have activity in the reservoir at reservoir conditions and possibly some adsorption and desorption of the surfactant onto the reservoir space that allows those effects or those modifications of that fluid system in the reservoir to continue for very long periods of time. And I think one other thing that differentiates us is that we see the ability to impact interfacial tension and surface tension and contact angle at very low concentrations. So when we go into these jobs and we displace our chemistry into the reservoir, we start with a higher concentration on the first application. And it serves two purposes. It has a remedial effect in the reservoir where it's removing damage, cleaning up that fracture network that was created through high pressure water and sand when the well was fracked. And then also eventually, allowing some of that residual oil or some of that oil that's left behind on that primary production process to be produced and recovered at the surface with a very low capital expenditure.
Sure. All right. Well, let's get into some of the news that you've made. And this is what it officially was. So your biosurfactant was the first ISO 14064 certified EOR technology. And what 14064 is a 3-part international standard for greenhouse gas management activities, including emissions inventories. So like I said earlier, this feels new in the world for oil and gas.
Sure. Yeah, we worked with SGS and provided data on our application case histories, and we're able to show what we did. And then SGS did the carbon accounting for those efforts and the offsets that we could gain by comparing it to drilling and fracking existing wells. So what that certification allows operators to do that are using our chemistry is to seek that into the reduction in scope and their carbon intensity accounting, which is becoming more and more important over time. So getting that standard or that ISO certification will be used by our operator partners that are interested in looking at reducing their carbon intensity. It's another arrow in the quiver of tools that these companies can do. I mean, there's a lot of things they can do to reduce their carbon intensity. In the natural gas world, they're reducing methane leaks and other things, topside wellhead. We're a little bit different in that it's a process or a procedure using the biosurfactant chemistry that's been certified by SGS to provide those benefits to the operators that use it in their operations.
Yeah, I think most people would think, now can these folks seek carbon credits?
Yeah.
Maybe not, right?
But yeah, and I think it's still developing like how that's going to be applied. But I think that step and at least getting the accounting and the methodology approved, I believe over time we're going to see operators taking advantage of that, and not quite sure exactly how it's going to play out, because what's interesting, Locus Bioenergy, we don't produce oil. We sell chemistries to operators that use our technologies for doing this. So it's a bolt-on or an add-on to our low carbon-based surfactants and our green chemistries that are being used. It's a bolt-on that can be used to add additional value to those barrels of oil. And perhaps at some time in the future, larger producers will be able to, like the natural gas market where they're charging premiums for certified green natural gas. I see that as being a potential use of this certification to get programs like that established.
Yeah, I spoke about this on a previous episode, but there's this idea of when I was doing fracking in the early 2010s, it was just a matter of, is this profitable or not, right? Like, are you in the money? And now we're talking so much about how energy efficient it is, how much CO2 it takes to make the oil and gas. I think back to my first memories of going out on a frack site and seeing all those diesel pumpers, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of fuel being used to make more oil. And so do you know, are we starting to see a lot more of a CO2 per barrel of oil or a CO2 needed per MCF?
Yeah, I think it's pretty early in actually formally accounting for things in that way. Operators are making choices today. And an example of that would be the electric frac fleets that run off of natural gas that's produced on the pad, right? There is some movement towards reducing that intensity of carbon related to producing oil and gas. And I think we certainly play a part in that and what that would look like, primarily getting into these existing assets and being able to improve production. But I think there's work to be done by operators to take this bull by the horns and really take it to its conclusion, which I think eventually will be a way to reduce that carbon intensity. And yeah, it's always kind of struck me as unusual when you're talking about the carbon intensity of producing a hydrocarbon, right? But the way that I think about it in my mind is the fact that these hydrocarbons are in our energy mix for a very long time. There is a carbon footprint that's directly associated with producing these hydrocarbons. The place where you can reduce reduce that intensity is by looking at things like this. How do we drill, frack, and complete and produce these wells and do them with as low of a carbon footprint as we can? Obviously the one way to reduce carbon intensity is to not use hydrocarbons, but I think everybody that looks at this issue understands that that's not a reasonable scenario. So in the near term, while some of the newer energy technologies are gaining market share, this is a way for operators and people to reduce that carbon intensity, understanding that we will have hydrocarbons in our energy mix for a long time.
Yeah, look, I think all's fair, right? Because if you look at a wind turbine, right, it takes a lot of steel, takes a lot of transport, takes a lot of energy, and certainly a carbon footprint to get, say, a wind turbine installed or even solar panels. I mean, that all requires an industrial process of some time. So I think if you were going to do some sort of inventory about how much CO2 it took to make oil and gas, that just go for the lifetime of any product, right?
There is no such thing as free energy, right? And every technology of the day has a certain cost associated with it. And I think people lose sight of that when we look at windmills and all these wonderful ways to produce energy and, it's a zero CO2 footprint. But you're absolutely right. Looking at that full life cycle cost of all ways to produce energy, I think it gets lost sometimes in the shuffle.
Right. I always talk to people who are in the oil and gas business. It seems like you're surrounded by Goliaths. Why do you think you guys were the first ones to get this ISO certification? Why did Chevron?
I'll offer an explanation of my thoughts about that. We've been working in this space for a long time, and we've been realizing the potential of our particular chemistry and seeing the types of production increases that we routinely get. And it seemed like a natural extension for us to go along that route and look for some kind of a certification of that methodology. I think a lot of the big guys are focusing on huge projects like carbon sequestration and actually recovering CO2 from the air and injecting it into deep sequestration and things like that. This technology, I think, allows smaller companies or operators that are interested in keeping their carbon bookkeeping clean and trying to find ways to reduce emissions. I think it's a smaller piece of that puzzle, right? Where I think eventually the larger companies are going to look at this and adopt this and do it. But for now, it offers an affordable, smaller picture. It's not billion-dollar investments in CO2 recovery machines and things like that that are super capital intensive and getting those types of operations underfoot. This is something that falls within the wheelhouse of normal well operations. It's not a massive change to how things are already done. And I think it's an easier way for those companies or early adopters to gain some benefits from producing a barrel of oil that has a lower carbon footprint.
I think what's kind of interesting to think about, and I'd have to assume this, is that the people who are probably taking you up on what you're offering here are probably the larger companies that would have a bigger obligation for how much carbon they're making.
Sure. Yeah. And in this world, we have taken a very conscious step to position ourselves as offering performance first and foremost. And that makes the concept or the adoption easier, right? When we have high performance chemistries that are price comparative or better than existing chemistries, this is kind of a bolt-on or an additional benefit that's there. And we're looking for operator partners that see this on a bigger scale and will look at it on a field level basis. But the bulk of our experience over the last several years has been working on what we call pilots, right? Where we do an application, we show performance, and then the next step is to roll it up into a bigger, wider application on a field level instead of an individual well basis. So yeah, we see great potential for this. But again, charging more for a product that has green credentials is not a successful business strategy. We have always focused first and foremost on the performance versus existing chemistries that are out there. And then this is an add-on or a value add to what we're already doing.
Yeah, when I was going into business school back in Austin, I remember I wrote my entrance paper and I say, I believe in a concept of envirocapitalism.
Yes.
It's almost like the fact that it's green will also drive the cleaner portion of it, right?
Yeah, it has to make economic sense, right? And that's another thing that I think gets lost when we talk about green technologies in general is great. It's economic with all these subsidies and things like that, but does it stand on its own, right? That's something that we're hyper aware of. We want to make sure that our technologies offer the performance that makes them an economic choice that makes sense. And then this is on top of that.
When you have this kind of management, these kinds of inventories, I'm curious, is there software out there? Is there a pre-existing way to account for it? Or is it you're inventing the way you account for these savings on your own? Could that be a little bit more streamlined, you think? think?
I think that's kind of next level, that we would look to a partner operator company that was going to work with us on a big way to develop, the devil's in the details, right? So we provided the framework and the certification and the methodology to chase these credits. The next step is, okay, how does it actually get done, right? And I think that's where we, as a small producer of biosurfactants, that's kind of out of our wheelhouse. So we would be looking for a partner to help us get to that next step where it's actually developed and accounted for and used to provide those benefits. So that work is in progress.
Yeah, well said. So being early into this, what do you think is next for you? And are there other certifications that you could be going for? It seems like now that you've gotten this first one, there might be other ones and other ways for you to be able to hopefully monetize these kind of certifications for your clients.
Sure. I think after receiving this first certification, we're going to kind of take a pause and look for some large scale adoptions of this technology. So find an operator partner that is able and willing to give this a shot on a bigger field type level and work through that process with them and help them to extract that additional value of what we think we can offer through this certification. So we're in all hands on deck mode, trying to get those opportunities lined up, get them proven out on a field level basis, and then continue moving. But it's a developmental process. We're still using this technology and we're still working in this space and just getting it out there and showing the performance and what our applications and what our biosurfactant can do across the U.S. and internationally. So we're in growth mode and really trying to get it out there. And as far as additional certifications, I don't see any in the near term. I think the next step for us will be getting it adopted by a large mover or somebody with a significant asset base that will really adopt the technology and use it to its full potential.
All right, Marty, I'm going to finish with a lightning round of your thoughts on different energy technologies, starting with natural gas.
Very plentiful supply. I would like to see that cost of energy be translated into increased manufacturing and all the things that we use energy for. We are just beginning to understand what that means.
Crude oil.
The United States, with the tight oil formations, we are blessed with enormous reserves. The oil industry deserves full credit for the ability to use new technology and basically go from being in an import position to being in an export position.
Nuclear.
Underutilized energy source. I feel strongly that nuclear energy should be a bigger part of our energy mix solely because of basically zero emissions. The downside to nuclear is the waste stream. Technologically, those solutions are there. I don't know what the future of nuclear energy is in the U.S., but I think we should look at it more.
Coal. And I'll add coal with carbon capture.
We built this country on the backs of energy provided by coal. I think coal has a place in our energy stream going forward. Coal plants run every day and they contribute to that base load. There are ways to process and mine coal that have a lower environmental impact. And I believe that we're doing better now than we ever have with coal.
We end.
I'm always intrigued, in particular in Texas, taking a look at all of the wind farms that are currently out there in the number one energy producing state, which is Texas. Wind certainly has a place in our energy mix, but to suggest or to think that wind could supplant all energy sources for electricity generation, I don't think that's a reasonable assumption.
Solar.
I'm with you from Ohio today. These landowners are being approached with a lot of leases for solar panels south of Columbus, Ohio. This is an interesting way where you take a multi-use property and you're replacing it with a singular source, which is solar. I'm concerned about the amount of acres that needs to be used to generate meaningful solar quantities.
Biofuels.
It's always puzzled me to basically take agriculture and food crops and convert them to energy when we have such huge sources of plentiful hydrocarbons in natural gas resources and things like that.
Hydroelectric.
You think about hydroelectric, it's a battery. It's a way to store energy. Unfortunately, the proximity of hydroelectric generation capabilities are not always where the population centers are, but hydroelectric is a great way to store and produce energy.
Geothermal.
I think in certain parts of the country where you have geothermal resources, it makes a lot of sense. And interestingly, geothermal development is a lot like oil and gas. You're drilling wells into deep, hot formations, and most of the time you're hydraulically fracturing those reservoirs so that you can move fluid through them. Definitely has a place in our energy mix.
Energy storage.
Yeah, energy storage is a tricky one. It's very difficult to store energy on the grid. I think hydroelectric certainly has potential for storing energy. There will probably be some new technologies that come up that are able to store large amounts of energy. You could also argue that reserves in the ground are energy storage. Those are all in storage for us for future generations.
Energy efficiency.
I think sometimes there's a disconnect where people think if they insulate their windows and put a little bit more insulation in their attics, that they're going to make a big difference in their energy consumption. Obviously, everything plays a part.
And then finally, fusion power.
We've been hearing and reading and thinking about fusion for a very long time, but I don't know when or how that's going to come about.
All right, Marty Shumway, Locus Bioenergy, thank you so much for your time.
You bet, Jay. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to talk to you, and I look forward to hearing this on your podcast.
That was Marty Shumway, Senior Vice President at Locus Bioenergy, a creator of oilfield drilling fluids and the producer of the world's first EOR-certified surfactant for greenhouse gas management. I want to thank Marty for his time, as well as Teresa DeJean and Mary Swanuit at Locus for setting this up. You can find plenty of pictures for this episode on energy-cast.com, as well as on Instagram at HostEnergy and Twitter at HostEnergyCast. All guests are sent the wrong completed audio the week of release. So far, no complaints. Be sure to leave us a positive review on iTunes. That gets the word out. Music was produced by Sean Stroop at Stroop Loops. That wraps up episode 181. Be sure to join us next week when we discuss how one company with a promising new generator had to make a difficult pivot away from EVs, but may have opened a whole new world of possibilities in the process. Until then, I'm Jay Downhauer. We'll see you next time.